You're listening to 94.4 FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show.
You're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show, with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi. Bringing you news from the local area and around the world. We bring Salford to the rest of the world and the rest of the world to Salford. And we've been very fortunate in this show to have interviewed some of the world's best athletes, sports people, coaches, people who work in sport in various different fields. And we've spoken to sports psychologists as well, and many different people who have various roles in sport. But we also have a segment on the show. We speak to people in the field of psychology and related fields, some of the most influential people in the world of psychology and related fields, to sort of give us an insight into their perspective on mental health, amongst other things. And today we have a special guest who's going to give us the insight into sports psychology. We're going back to the world of sports psychology again, performance psychology, and she's worked with many elite athletes. I'm sure she'll tell us more about her work. And I'm sure many of our listeners will be interested to know what a performance psychologist does. So Sophie Bashford, performance psychologist, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's really great to be here and be part of the conversation and help grow what this discipline is all about. So
Absolutely. One of the things we aim to do on the show is to raise awareness and increase participation in sport, and no doubt performance psychology is sort of raise awareness to people what it's all about. And I suppose we start from the beginning, Sophie. How did you get involved? What sort of inspired you to become a performance psychologist?
So I guess I've always kind of been interested in my sport growing up as a child. I was born in England, in the northeast of England, in Newcastle, and all my roots are there, and all my family, extended family, are still there. And at that time I did figure skating and a few other different sports. That was kind of my main sport. And then when I was 10, I moved to Australia, and our first year in Australia was 2000, in the Sydney Olympic Games. And we were really lucky to be able to go to loads of the different events at the Summer Olympics. Mm-hmm. And there I actually saw rhythmic gymnastics for the first time.
Yeah.
And it's actually really quite similar to ice skating. If you take away the ice, it's a similar-ish kind of movement and skill, I guess, with the body. Mm-hmm. And then I really got into rhythmic gymnastics when I moved to Melbourne after our year in Sydney. Mm-hmm. And at the same time as that, I also did rowing. I was a cox because I was quite small. Mm-hmm. And I really got heavily involved in those two sports and represented, my state and a relatively high level. Mm-hmm. And I just really fell in love with sport, and it just gave me so much joy as a child growing up. Mm-hmm. And I also experienced, a few injuries and setbacks along the way. Mm-hmm. And I probably didn't realise it at the time, but I probably would have benefited from seeing a sports psych around that.
Yeah.
So when it was time to kind of go to university, I knew I wanted to do something in sport, but I didn't know if it would be physiology, physiotherapy, psychology, media, all sorts of different things. I wasn't sure. So I did a generic kind of sports degree. I came back here to the northeast of England and did a Bachelor of Arts in Sport. Mm-hmm. And that allowed me to really explore all the different types of disciplines that exist when in the sporting arena, I guess. Mm-hmm. And it was really there that I fell in love with psychology, and probably credit to my high school teacher too in Australia, because both me and my sister have gotten into psychology. So he obviously was a really good teacher, and we still keep in contact with him now. And
wow.
Yes, I think he influenced it. My love for sport influenced it. Yeah. And then when I got to learn more and more about sports psychology specifically, that was the route that I really wanted to go down, and it really stood out to me.
No, brilliant. That's a really interesting journey that you sort of mentioned there, Sophie. And in terms of the sort of the challenges you've had in sort of becoming a performance psychologist on the way, what can you sort of share? What are some of the challenges that sort of you sort of faced in your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't regret for a moment doing my undergrad in sports, because that allowed me to really understand where I wanted to go and what I had a true passion in. I then did a master's in sports psychology after that, and my naivety at the time, kind of going through all the different stages and really understanding what you needed to become a qualified sports psych, wasn't great understanding at the time. So despite being a great master's course, it wasn't BPS accredited for stage 1.
Yeah.
So then I did a postgrad diploma in psychology, because to become a chartered and registered psych, you need an undergrad in psych. So I did that. Like I said, don't regret that for the people I met and the experiences I had. And then I had to go do my master's in sports psych again when it was accredited by BPS stage 1 registered, and I could only do that once I finished my postgrad dip. So I kind of walked away with 4 degrees.
Wow.
Which isn't the most simplest route to have done.
No, absolutely.
But it's really important, actually, and I do share that story quite a lot with people who reach out to me and ask about how to become a sports psych, because if you want to become registered through the BPS and HCPC registered, which I now am, you really do need to go through the right hoops and go through the right routes and ask the right questions and do the right courses along the way.
Yeah, absolutely,
So that was definitely a challenge, but some of it I wouldn't change.
No, that's an important point you've made there. It's an interesting point too, and I suppose we've seen, like, not necessarily an explosion, but we've seen a lot of, teams, sporting teams, football teams now bring psychologists in. I mean, I was reading the paper last week, and I believe that the manager at United has brought a psychologist in, for example. But with that, and I think you made some really important points for our listeners, for sure, and I mean, for me, one of the things that I think it's a great thing, Sophie, that obviously the people in the field, are getting involved. I can see obviously the value of it, but there's that sort of fine line between, say, how important it is to if you're going to work as a psychologist, such, to be registered, because obviously, I'm not saying people can't help people mentally in other areas, but there is that fine line knowing about the work you do. One of my concerns has been, to be honest, is if people don't understand the field very well, then they can sort of possibly do more damage if it's a clinical issue, if that makes any sense, and they don't recognise that, and they sort of maybe take on more than they can do, if they're not sort of registered and qualified properly. And that's one of the worries, I think, in terms of and I think it's great that you've mentioned you've got you're chartered and you're registered and sort of clear. What are your sort of thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I think it's important for the discipline, and it gives people confidence that when they seek psychological support in whatever realm of that it may be, whether it's sport, clinical, all sorts of the different, I guess, fields of psychology, that it hopefully gives people a confidence that who they're working with is someone who has been supervised, has been, I guess, approved and fit to work, that they are not just knowledgeable and an expert in what they do, but also, it gives the client and a level of protection, but it also gives us protection as well, and it also means that I'm governed by all sorts of ethics and boundaries linked to being a psychologist, which, in certain conversations is really important to remember. And hopefully it gives both of us that confidence that when we work together, it's a safe place and we are working in a way that respects ethical boundaries. Absolutely, so I think it's really important.
Absolutely. And it's sort of knowing you have to recognise certain things that may be of clinicals. That sort of fine line, at least the way I see it, between, say, a possible clinical issue and a performance issue. Say if an athlete, for example, says they're feeling down and low mood, and it's not a question of sort of trying to pump them up or just trying to identify if it is maybe a referral that they need to see someone who's a specialist in an area. They could be suffering, bereavement, they could be suffering from trauma or something like that, and just it's more of a clinical issue. And I think that's
definitely.
Yeah,
and I've experienced those kind of situations myself in my field. I'm a performance psychologist, specifically trained and educated and knowledgeable in sports performance and exercise psychology, and absolutely I have an understanding and an appreciation and a level of knowledge around clinical mental health issues, but I'd be the first one to say, you know what, I'm not the best person right now to give you the support that I think you need, and my training isn't the thing that will help you right now. And knowing when to refer and recognizing the importance of that and having that network of support around you to be able to do that's really important.
Absolutely, and obviously with yourself being sort of chartered and you'll understand a network of people that you can sort of go through that sort of channels. And I suppose for the listeners, that's the sort of benefit obviously of that too, sort of having an awareness of what's the next step if someone comes along and what to do. But that's really interesting, and it's interesting to hear your take on it as well, and certainly for our listeners who are considering getting into the field. I think that you've given some good, obviously it's not advice as such, people can listen in and make their own mind up what they do, but I think your journey is quite helpful to people sort of considering going aboard. And I think we've mentioned there's a great point, some courses you do, that the value of the course is great anyway. It just depends on what you want to do, I suppose, in the field. That's the sort of key. I suppose we talked about challenges. What about highlights? Now that you've had many highlights, Sophie, can you share some of the highlights that you've had on your journey?
Yeah, I think, for me, one of the highlights really was probably getting my first job.
Wow.
It's such a hard field to get into sometimes, and my route, I didn't go down the PhD route and kind of getting a foot in the door that way. And so that moment where actually someone was willing to give you an opportunity and recognize, there are a few gaps here in your experience, but we're going to give you that opportunity to show us and demonstrate that you can learn and you can develop. And I also think that's a really important, part for people to take away from this conversation too, that if you can be willing to show where you can get to and what you're aspiring to do, even if you're not there yet, I think it's really important. So it sounds, I guess, a little bit cliche, but that first opportunity to really do what I wanted to do, because I took a risk in leaving a pretty good retail job to go, this could be a great career, but it's not what I want to do. So I took a risk and left that job to really pursue what I was passionate about. And so that was a real highlight for sure.
Yeah, and that's really, Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
No, that's really interesting. That's you made a really interesting point there. The sort of PhD road. I suppose there's probably people in this list sort of considering doing that. But I think it's the sort of balance, Sophie, where sometimes it's like, okay, if one commits themselves to a PhD, then they won't have the time to obviously study other things that they might want to study as well and look into. And like someone like yourself who's sort of done, many courses as well to get to where you are. I suppose it depends on the person, really. I mean, there is a case for doing the PhD, but there's also a case for sort of thinking, okay, well, actually, there's other things I want to look into and learn, and if that sort of makes any sense too. There's only so much time we've got every day, so
definitely,
definitely,
for sure. I think some of the other highlights have just been, when I could name some around like just the places you get to go, the people that you get to meet, watching some of the athletes that you've worked with and the staff just excel on the world stage, or not even excel, but just perform, and them reaching their own career aspirations in terms of what they've dedicated 12 plus, 20 years to, and just seeing them reach their potential, like, really is satisfying. But just even on small scales, like the challenges that I support athletes and coaches and staff to overcome at times, when you see that progress being made is really powerful. And I think it's those little things that you need to appreciate, and those small highlights along the way, as well as the ones that come every 4 years. But 4 years is a long time, and if we wait until the end of the Olympic cycle in the sports that I work with predominantly, that's a long time to wait for a highlight, which sometimes might not come because it is a tough field to compete in. So taking those little moments, I think, and just seeing people excel in their journeys and overcome their individual challenges is really rewarding.
Brilliant. And just for our listeners, I mean, we spoke about sort of how you got into, your challenges and some of the highlights. And what's like, I know it's not going to be a typical day, but generally speaking, what does a day involve for you? What does the work of the performance psychology sort of involve for our listeners sort of who aren't sort of familiar with that role?
Yeah, so I guess in my role, it will, like you said, there's probably not a typical day that looks quite similar, but it'll be working either with the athletes themselves on a one-to-one basis, or maybe in a team environment if they're in a team sport or a crew or something like that in rowing, and really trying to develop their psychological skills to, I guess, thrive and be able to maintain that healthy well-being, a little bit like what we touched on before, but also that pursuit of excellence, and really developing a healthy balance of those things. But also, when it comes to that performing under pressure and being able to, when it matters most, really deliver your best performance, and having the strategies that can help you focus, minimize those distractions around you, and just commit to doing what you need to do in that moment to be the best that you can be. And so that might be working one-to-one with the athletes, it might be the team, it might actually be working, a lot of my work is with the coaches themselves, and helping the coaches to just problem solve and understand and implement certain strategies or ways of working that then they kind of deliver in their training sessions or through the athletes or the teams that they work with. And then it might be the same with some of the sports science team in terms of, doing a lot of work through the physio or the S&C coaches who see the athletes a lot in their role, and being able to help them as practitioners to not just deliver themselves and the best version of themselves, but also be able to implement, I guess, some of those psychologically informed kind of principles into their own work when they're working with the athletes themselves. So, it could be a real mix of on the ground with all the different practitioners or coaches or athletes. It might be a little bit higher up with, like, the system and the leaders of the team in terms of the environment or the culture that we're trying to create and develop. And then sometimes it's a real strategic kind of day where, we're trying to write and deliver what we think is the best strategy, for this next cycle is kind of something we're thinking about in rowing at this moment in time.
That's really interesting,
2020 into Paris.
Of course, that's interesting you say. So like the psychologist will be involved in the cycle of competition, Sophie. So obviously you got the sports scientist and coaches. So that's like a collective effort in terms of planning as well, or is that a factor as well in the sort of planning of a cycle for the athlete? Yeah,
absolutely. And just trying to understand, like, what does that cycle might look like? Where are the times that we're looking to perform? Where are the times that we're doing real training blocks? And therefore, those different ebbs and flows of that Olympic cycle. What does a psychologically informed environment look like, and what does my role look like, and how can I help those people to embed some of those kind of principles, particularly because in my roles, like with one of the sports I work with in rowing, I'm only 3 days a week, and with skeleton, I'm only 1.5 days a week. So, actually the greatest impact I could have is supporting those people through the cycle who are there more consistently than I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and absolutely. That's really interesting. And in terms of, say, like an individual, just for our listeners, in terms of they're probably thinking, okay, well, say an individual you work with an individual. What can the performance psychologist? What are some of the areas that the performance psychologist can sort of help? I know obviously this is there's many things and it's sort of difficult to pinpoint. Just as a sort of general idea for the listeners, an athlete comes along, and what generally is some of the what does the performance psychologist do with the athlete to sort of help them to get that extra or to compete at their best ability?
Yeah, I think some of the probably common kind of topics that come up in the conversations I have with the athletes I work with will be around things like confidence and being able to feel confident. But then my kind of the approach I take with that is actually actions come first, feelings come later. We might be waiting a while to feel confident.
Of course, yeah.
If I waited to feel confident to do this, I might not have ever actually picked up the phone, because that feeling might not never have come. But I can, we can act first, feel later. So, but that notion of confidence and feeling ready and feeling like you can take on that challenge, and you've got that skill and that competence and that belief in yourself to be able to do it, and you feel ready for that challenge ahead, and that you also enjoy it a little bit too, because if we don't enjoy it, that's, there's a reason we got into sport, because we all
Absolutely.
loved it, so it's important to keep that. But it might be around confidence, it might be about like focusing and just navigating some of that noise around you, either externally from competitors or the environment or people or judges or other teammates, but also that internal distraction, those little inner voices that pipe up and throw in their 2 cents, and some of those feelings that might show up that try and distract us. So it might be around focusing and our attention and just being really present. I work a bit from an ACT point of view too, so just being really present and in the moment, and not being too distracted by the things within us or around us. It's remaining really adaptable, and being able to remain attentive and adaptable and be able to assess the risk and reward, in terms of decision making and race plans and strategies, and when do you need to commit and deliver to your race plan, and back yourself to do it, but when actually might you need to adapt and change and do something a little bit different, because actually the context that you're in has changed, and it requires us to think a bit differently and make those decisions in the moment.
Yes.
So things around that and decision making, and a lot, if it is a team sport, just how you collectively do that together as a team. You have that team identity, and you understand your own personalities, other people's personalities, your strengths, the things that make you great, and collectively what you bring to that team has real positive impact. There's probably loads more, but they're kind of some of the headlines.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I find it really interesting, and I think that one thing that sort of interests me is like, okay, obviously, we know that the psychological part of any sport is a big variable. But if you look at, say, for example, the physical, physiological, you've got like fitness test, and you can see the players, how much ground they cover. For example, in a team sport, individual sport, you look at, they're monitored in a physical way. Technical, you can do an analysis. Is there a way to psychologically know obviously, if you it goes without saying, if the psychologist plays a big part in the athletes achieving, but do you have a way of measuring? Is there a way of the performance psychology measuring what they do in terms of working with the athlete?
Yeah, there's a whole heap of kind of objective measures that are available, which the before doing an intervention or embarking, I guess, on a piece of work together, it can be a really good indication of where you started, and then in 6, 8, 12 weeks' time, if you complete that again, you can see if there's any change that's come about. So depending on what you're working on, there's likely going to be like a questionnaire or an objective measure to help you. But I also really like asking questions at the beginning of sessions or the beginnings of a piece of work that we just keep checking in with. So like, you know, typically if an athlete comes to me on a one-to-one basis and they go, I really like some time with you today, you know, one of the first questions I ask is, okay, what's going to be most helpful for us today for the next 60 minutes or however long we might have? And they'll come out with the thing that they want to, you know, work on, or the strategies that they want to, or they'd like some strategies for X, for example. And I'll go, okay, how much of a problem does this feel for you right now? Like on a scale of 0 to 10, like where would you put this? And I always, you can't do 5 because it's in the middle. You can do 5.5, I can do 4.5, but you can't do 5. But, you know, how much does this feel like a problem for you? Or in terms of the strategies you already have, like how much do they feel like they're helping you move forward? And they'll give me a number. And then at the end of the session, before we leave, I'll just go, okay, how much does it feel like we can move forward now? Or how much does this feel like a problem for you now, 60 minutes later, or however long? And hopefully I give them that they can be truthful. But more often than not, we might nudge up that scale, just even by half or by 1 point. And so things like that I think are really helpful. Or getting them to describe the problem for them as they see it now, like what words they would use, you know, if it was scaling, and then check that back in a few weeks' time. But most importantly is behaviourally, what would we see different if we were to be able to move this forward or solve this problem? Like how would you be acting or thinking or feeling differently? And again, if we can describe that, and then in 6 weeks' time we re-describe it for them, then it gives us an indication of how much we've progressed or maybe not.
Of course, and then as a result of that, the performance in the idea is for the performances, the level of performance to sort of to be better. Is that obviously the overall key is for the athlete to reach the full potential?
Absolutely. And I try as much as possible to work with like performance analysts and things like that in the team, or if it is like an injury related kind of thing that we're working on, like working with the physio or the S&C, for example, because then they also have a lot of objective measures, and so then when we start to piece all of that puzzle together and we're looking at data from all the different kind of disciplines or their holistic performance, working with those people to help paint the picture too is really helpful.
Absolutely. And I suppose the level that you work, I mean, you know, the sort of, it's marginal between athletes. There's sort of really fine margins. You know, there's so many variables. There's so many fine margins in terms of on the day itself performing. You can perform to your best, but I suppose at the level that you work at, you know, performing at your best, it's one of them things really where sometimes people, you know, just maybe perform beyond, and it's just this margins are so fine, really, aren't they? To be fair, so you could be your best that day, but someone else could be better. Absolutely, absolutely. And
it really is fine margins.
Yeah,
but again, I think that's where it's really important to find that fulfillment and that drive and that purpose in other ways that is beyond the result itself. And
absolutely,
exploring with athletes and staff and coaches, like, you know, what their drivers are, what their why is, like what they want from their performances beyond results and medals and outcomes, and really trying to encourage winning on that level.
Absolutely, that's a great point for sure. And you know, we see that in a lot of sports where the identity of the sports person or the athlete, the footballer, becomes so heavily linked to their sports, and then when they do sort of, obviously sports only, you can only participate no matter how good you are for so long at the highest level. That, they're sort of making that transition can be challenging for some people. So does a performance psychologist have any role in that as well, Sophie, in terms of like helping sports people sort of transition, or is that something that's done completely separately?
No, absolutely. It definitely is something that I help with, and then I'm also really lucky to work alongside performance lifestyle advisors in the sports that I work with them too. So together, the pair of us can really support an athlete through that transition. And we like to start where the energy can be given and start those conversations as early as possible, really, to ensure as best placed that transition is healthy and effective. But it's, how long is a transition? For some they're weeks, for some they're months or years. So, but yes, I think navigating through that change by developing other identities, by having interests outside of the sport, where the sports can support them in other activities away, career-wise, or developing their own CVs and interests and skill set away from the sport.
Absolutely.
Their motivations, their values, their purpose in the sport, but also away from it. Yeah, it's a huge part of what I do, whether it's directly with the athletes in the sports or also alongside the performance lifestyle advisors that I work with.
Absolutely. And in terms of anyone sort of looking to go into the field of performance psychology who's listening in, and I mean, I know it's impossible to give any advice because we're all on our own journey, and everyone's got their own unique set of experiences. But what would you say? What would a couple of things that sort of on your journey? There's a long way to go on your journey, Sophie. But just up to the point now, I mean, what would you, any sort of one sort of listening in? I mean, they could be someone who's sort of just done their A level, maybe someone sort of considering doing what you did, make a transition to from a different career. But what are some things that you could maybe share that might be interesting for sort of people listening if they're sort of considering going down the role of performance psychology?
I think if you have an interest in it and a passion in it, do what you love. Do what gives you energy, and do what helps you feel fulfilled. And sometimes it's all right to take that adventure, even though we're not sure where it might end up. But yes, we talked about at the beginning of this, the challenges in terms of becoming a registered qualified psychologist. But don't let that scare you. There's plenty of ways in which now that it's developed and changed since I began my journey that makes it a little bit more accessible. But it's not impossible. We're all testament to that. So if it's something you're interested in, yes, do the research, but don't let it put you off. There's so many things out there now in terms of either short courses or online courses or books. And yes, that's not going to get you, your registration, but if you're interested in it and you want to read a bit more, there's so many fantastic resources to be able to just start sparking your interest and getting excited about it. And I think generally we're a pretty good discipline in terms of helping people just understand more about it and learn a little bit more about it. So get in touch with people as well, and don't be afraid to reach out. And yeah, I think just if you're already on that journey and you've already started it and you're working towards your chartership or your accreditations, I think just taking the wins as they come and taking those small wins each day is really important. And growing your method, growing your philosophy. But for me, one of the most important things is doing that in a really authentic way. I guess I've had experiences along the way where people have seen opportunities for me to develop in a certain way or develop certain skill sets, but it just hasn't felt authentic to me. And I really went through a little bit of a battle of, is that a style or a type of, way of working that I want? And maybe it's not, but I think developing your method, developing your philosophy in a way that is workable and you're confident in, but also really authentic in, is really important.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's sort of, really interesting, and no doubt anyone sort of listening in who is considering sort of going on that road, I think there's some useful information there, especially, that there's a number of things that are accessible to them to see if they, like it, and it's for them really before they commit, because obviously it is a big commitment to sort of go down the registered road and just sort of see and see if it's for them and go from there. But that's been really interesting speaking to you. So I've sort of really, I've really found it interesting speaking to you, and know that the listeners have as well. So we want to wish you all the best, for your career moving forward. No doubt that there's going to be many highlights to come along. And really want to thank you for coming aboard the Friday Sports Show. That was Sophie Bashford. She's a BPS chartered HCPC registered performance psychologist. She works with some of the world's best athletes, and no doubt will continue to do so. It was kind enough to join us on the Friday Sports Show, 94.5 FM, with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi.